Welcome to this cozy corner of history. Settle in and let me tell you tales of a time long past. Before we begin our journey into the Middle Ages, tell me where you are tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Are you ready to sleep, or are you just settling in for some calming history to unwind after a long day? If you appreciate these tranquil reflections from the past, I encourage you to subscribe so you never miss an episode. There is a unique charm in allowing the past to softly speak as you unwind. Now let's establish the setting. Picture, if you will, a modest medieval village at the break of day. The air is fresh and cool, the sky is just starting to show hints of pink and gold. A rooster calls from afar, signaling the arrival of a new day. Gradually, the village begins to awaken. Smoke billows from thatched huts as peasant families light fires to warm their meager meals. The smell of wood smoke blends with the earthy scent of livestock. Cattle softly moo in their pens, anticipating the milkmaid's touch. Pigs root contentedly in their sty. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes as he stokes his forge, preparing for a long day of shaping iron. These are the sights, sounds, and smells that would greet a medieval peasant each morning. A familiar tapestry of hardship and toil. To be a peasant in the Middle Ages meant being held by the relentless cycle of backbreaking labor beneath the oppressive weight of the feudal system. Most peasants resided in small one-room huts, their straw roofs requiring painstaking replacement as they rotted away every few years. The walls were constructed of wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden strips plastered with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw. A single room functioned as the kitchen, bedroom, and living area for the whole family. Their bedding consisted only of straw piled on the dirt floor. Furniture was minimal and sparse, perhaps a wooden table and bench, a chest for valuables, and if fortunate, a straw mattress for the parents. Children slept on the floor or in the loft above the animal quarters, where the rising heat provided warmth in winter. Food was as fundamental as their living conditions. Most peasants ate a diet of coarse barley bread, pottage, a stew of grains and vegetables, and whatever small yield they could grow in their gardens. Meat was a rare luxury, typically reserved for special occasions or when an animal was too old or ill to be useful. Even ale, the dominant drink of the era, was weak and thin, consumed more for its calories than enjoyment. Water was frequently too contaminated for drinking, particularly in urban centers. Consequently, ale was consumed by all ages, from children to the aged. This meager provision, coupled with relentless manual labor, resulted in most peasants suffering from chronic malnutrition and a host of diseases their exhausted bodies could not overcome. Dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, and the merciless bubonic plague, which periodically swept through Europe like a scythe, mercilessly culled the population, resulting in shockingly low life expectancy. A peasant was fortunate to live to 40. Many children died before their 5th birthday from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Childbirth was perilous for both mother and infant, with many women dying from labor complications or postpartum infections. Despite overwhelming disadvantages, the peasantry persisted. They worked from dawn till dusk, their lives governed by seasonal cycles and the desires of their lords. Within the feudal structure, peasants occupied the lowest tier, owing the land they cultivated to the aristocracy. This feudal system was an intricate network of duties and allegiances, with the king at the top and the commoners at the bottom. Between them were the great lords and ladies, dukes, earls, barons, and knights who possessed vast lands granted by the king. In exchange for this land, known as a fief, the nobles pledged their fealty and military service to the crown. However, they did not cultivate the land themselves, that labor fell to the peasants, who were bound to the noble estates in a form of indentured servitude, in return for the right to cultivate a small plot for their own food. Peasants were required to work the lord's fields, care for his animals, mend his boundaries and structures, and pay him a share of their crops as rent. This was a life of constant toil with meager compensation. Two primary classes of peasants existed, freemen and villeins. Freemen, by the name, possessed marginally greater independence than their villein peers. Though still owing allegiance to their lords, they could possess their own tools and animals and even accumulate enough money to purchase their freedom. Villeins, conversely, were essentially slaves. They were tied to the land, prohibited from leaving the estate without their lord's consent. They owned no property and were subject to their lord's justice and arbitrary will. Should a villain die without an heir, all his possessions would revert to his lord. Regardless of their legal standing, all peasants endured the same daily routine. They rose at dawn, often roused by a rooster's crow or the church bells. Following a quick breakfast, they would head to the fields, guiding their animals ahead of them, cows to the pasture, pigs to the woods to gather acorns and roots, and sheep to the hills. In spring, the ploughman would attach his team of oxen to the heavy wooden plough, the blade sinking deep into the earth as he walked through the long furrows. It was exhausting labor, the sun scorching his back, and flies incessantly buzzed around the sweating animals. At the end of every row, he would stop to wipe his forehead, then strain on the plough handles to pivot the cumbersome machine for the next pass. After the soil was ploughed, the sewer would walk the field, distributing valuable seed from a sack worn around his neck. He needed to avoid scattering it either too densely or too sparsely. Excess seed would suffocate the young plants, whereas too little would allow weeds to establish themselves. Simultaneously, he had to deal with flocks of hungry birds that would descend to devour the freshly planted grain. During summer, peasants closely monitored their maturing crops, protecting them from predatory animals and thieves. They dedicated long hours to weeding, hoeing, and eradicating insect pests, all under the intense sun. At harvest, the entire village organized to gather the valuable grain before the rains arrived. Men, women, and children joined together, wielding sickles to cut and bind the wheat into sheaves from morning until evening. It was a race against time and the elements, as a single storm could bring disaster. The ripe grain was flattened and left to rot on the stalk. Once the harvest was in, the sheaves had to be threshed to separate the grain from the chaff. This was accomplished with a flail, two wooden sticks linked by a short chain, which the thresher swung overhead to beat the sheaves, the rhythmic thud, 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 echoing across the fields. The grain was then winnowed, tossed into the air so the breeze could blow away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier kernels to fall to the ground. It was then gathered and taken to the Lord's mill to be ground into flour, with the miller taking his share of the proceeds. No part of the harvest was wasted. The straw was used for roofing, bedding, or feeding livestock. Any remaining gleanings in the field were free for the poor to collect, a custom tracing back to biblical times. While men worked the fields, women managed an endless cycle of tasks: milking cows, churning butter, making cheese, baking bread, brewing ale, spinning wool and cloth, sewing garments, tending the cottage garden, gathering firewood, drawing water from the well, and cooking the scarce food. Peasant children were also required to contribute. When they reached walking age, they were immediately tasked with scaring birds from the fields, collecting eggs, harvesting vegetables, or tending to geese and sheep. There was no room for education or recreation. Childhood was merely a short pause before a lifetime of toil. Even the old and frail were expected to contribute their abilities, whether spinning, weaving, mending, or managing the fire. Peasants had no retirement, they labored until death. Thus was the existence of the medieval peasant, a life marked by ceaseless labor and suffering. Their destinies were bound to the land and their lords. Yet among these humble people, some names have resonated through history. Their tales attest to the resilience and spirit of the common individual. William Langland, a 14th-century ploughman who became a poet, was one such figure. Born into a poor peasant family, Langland spent his youth working the fields, his hands calloused from gripping the rough wooden handles, his face weathered by sun and wind. Yet Langland possessed a restless mind and a burning thirst for knowledge. During brief rests between his labors, he would listen intently to the parish priest's sermons, memorizing Bible stories. He learned to read and write, rare accomplishments for a peasant, and began to compose his own verses. Langland's masterpiece, Piers Plowman, is a vast allegory detailing the journey of an ordinary man, Piers, across a setting marked by social injustice and religious corruption. Through Piers' perspective, Langland exposed the unfairness of the feudal system, the avarice of the nobility, and the hypocrisy of the church. He articulated the suffering of the peasantry, their arduous labor and destitution, and their desire for improvement. In one memorable passage, Piers laments that he has no money to buy pullets, geese, or pigs, but only 2 green cheeses, some curds and cream, an oatcake, and 2 loaves of beans and bran baked for his children. Yet he declares by his soul that he has no salt bacon, not a smidgen of smoked meat smouldering in his sideboards. Langland's words resonated with the common people who viewed Piers as a champion of their cause. Piers Plowman was a widely circulated manuscript long before the printing press. Langland's genius is evident in the fact that his poem has survived for over 6 centuries. It offers a view of the medieval peasant world and a call for social justice that remains relevant today. For Langland, writing was a means to escape the limitations of peasant life, give voice to the unheard, and aspire to a better world. In Piers Plowman, he forged an enduring symbol of the common man's struggle. A simple ploughman who, through faith and fortitude, could guide his people toward a more just and equitable society. Langland's own life remains mysterious, with little known of his final years or fate. Yet his legacy endures in the text, reminding us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can soar on the wings of imagination and hope. As we depart from William Langland and his ploughman hero, we shift our focus to another group of peasants whose existence was deeply connected to the land and its inhabitants, the shepherds and goat herders. In many respects, the shepherd's life was even more isolated and demanding than that of the ploughman or reaper. Though field workers enjoyed the company of their colleagues, the shepherd endured long days and nights in solitude with his flock, traversing hillsides and valleys seeking grazing. This work demanded significant skill and knowledge. A competent shepherd needed to understand the needs and behaviors of his animals, discern subtle weather and predator signs, and know which plants were safe for his sheep to eat and which were toxic. To care for an ailing lamb, a shepherd must manage its recovery. He also had to guard his flock against numerous threats, including wolves and wild dogs, thieves and rustlers, and even occasional bears or mountain lions. Armed with only a staff and a sling, the shepherd was prepared to risk his life for his sheep. This was a solitary life, accompanied only by the bleating of the flock and the occasional bark of the herding dog for company. Shepherds might go weeks or months without encountering another human face, finding shelter only in a rough lean-to or hillside cave. During summer heat, they would guide their flocks to high mountain pastures, tracking the receding snow line. There, in the thin, crisp air, the sheep would graze on abundant alpine grasses, accumulating fat for the coming winter. As autumn neared, shepherds began their long descent to the lands, the sheep's wool heavy with summer growth. This journey was perilous, the narrow mountain track slick with ice and snow, constantly facing avalanches and rockfalls. Upon returning to the valley, the sheep were confined to stone-walled pens. The wool was shorn and spun into yarn for garments and coverings. The shepherd's labor continued without end. Even in winter's depths, he watched over his flock, ensuring they were fed and sheltered from the bitter cold. Though life was hard, it brought rewards. Deep satisfaction in knowing his skill and dedication kept the animals safe and thriving, and that the wool and meat enjoyed by people were the fruits of his labor. In the tranquil moments, as the sun set over the hills and the sheep settled for the night, the shepherd found solace in the surrounding landscape's beauty. The light on the grass, the lark's song, and the distant sound of a mountain stream offered this comfort to some. Many shepherds, being deeply devout, perceived an echo of the divine in their humble work. Was not Christ himself often depicted as a shepherd, tending to his flock of faithful with loving care? This spiritual dimension of the shepherd's life is beautifully captured in the English medieval carol, The Shepherd's Song, which imagines a group of shepherds on the night of Christ's birth. The shepherd upon a hill he sat. He had on him his tabard and his hat, his tar-box, his pipe, and his flagoat. His name was called Jollywot, for he was a good herdsboy. The carol then details how shepherds are visited by an angel announcing the Saviour's birth, prompting them to rush to Bethlehem to honor the newborn king. The shepherds ran to Bethlehem to witness the beam of that blessed Son, finding Mary and Joseph in their dwelling, and Jesus Christ, God's Son. For the medieval peasant, the nativity story held a special resonance. The concept that God chose to be born not in a palace, but in a humble stable surrounded by field beasts. This served as a reminder that even the most lowly and marginalized possess worth in the divine view, highlighting a spiritual dimension to even the most menial tasks. Naturally, not all shepherds were saintly figures. Like any group, they had rogues and scoundrels, those who stole from neighbors' flocks or neglected their own animals for drink and dice. However, the shepherd was generally a respected figure in medieval society, his knowledge and skill highly valued by the community. In an era where wool was a vital commodity, a good shepherd could command a fair wage and enjoy social standing. So the next time you wear a woolen sweater or snuggle under a warm blanket, pause for the medieval shepherd, the solitary figure on the hillside, his watchful eyes and steady hand guiding his flock through the changing seasons. His simple faith is a beacon amidst toil and uncertainty. As we leave the pastures behind, we descend into the dark, dank world of the medieval city, a place of narrow, winding streets and overhanging timber. As sunlight first struck the thatched roofs of the village, the peasants awoke from sleep. Roosters crowed, signaling the beginning of another long, arduous day. Men, women, and children rose from their straw mattresses, their breaths steaming in the cold morning air. They began their day with a meager meal of coarse bread and weak ale, sustenance for the labor that awaited them. Existence for a medieval peasant was a harsh and ceaseless struggle. They lived in small, cramped huts, their earthen floors covered with rushes to ward off dampness and cold. A hearth fire filled the single room with smoke, and a rough-hewn table and stools were the sole furnishings. Windows were narrow slits in the walls, shuttered against the weather. Privacy was non-existent. Entire families shared the same space, sleeping side by side on pallets. Peasants were tied to the land, subject to the lords and nobles who owned the vast estates. The feudal system that governed medieval society offered little scope for personal freedom or progression. A peasant's life was predetermined from birth, bound to cultivate the same land as their forebears, marry within their social class, and bequeath their scant wealth to their offspring. They were born into bondage and likely would die in it, their short lives characterized by relentless suffering. The rhythm of a peasant's day was solely determined by the sun's cycle. Awakening occurred with the first light, frequently accompanied by the tolling of church bells marking matins. Following a meager breakfast, they commenced their assigned duties. Men proceeded to the fields to manage crops and animals. Women provided sustenance for the children, gathered eggs, milked cattle, and drew water from the village well. They also baked bread, brewed ale, and maintained vegetable plots. Even the youngest children had responsibilities, such as deterring birds from seeds, gathering firewood, or assisting with laundry. Meals were taken quickly to conserve daylight. At noon, peasants would eat cheese, onions, and bread, accompanied by watered wine or ale. Meat was a rare treat, consumed only during festivals or when an animal became ill and required slaughter. Dinner consisted of a thin stew of vegetables and grains, occasionally enhanced with salted pork or fish on holy days. As the sun set, peasants returned to their huts, weary and hungry. After eating their paltry supper, they fell into exhausted sleep, only to rise and immediately begin the backbreaking cycle again hours later. It was a life of grinding poverty and relentless toil with little respite or hope for improvement. The most arduous and vital labor of the peasantry, perhaps, occurred in the fields. The ploughman labored from dawn till dusk, tilling the heavy, rich clay soil while walking behind a lumbering ox or horse-drawn plough. This was slow, exhausting work, demanding immense strength and endurance. The plough was a primitive tool, essentially a sharpened stick that merely scratched the earth's surface. The ploughman constantly had to adjust the implement's depth and angle, navigating rocks and roots that threatened to break the blade. Even a skilled worker could only manage about an acre per day. A small plot yielded just enough food for a family. Medieval agriculture made this work harder. Fields were divided into long, narrow strips, separated by raised banks of turf intended for access to ploughing and sowing. However, this system meant farmers often had strips scattered across the manor, requiring long journeys to reach their land. Once the soil was turned, the sourness caused the precious seed to scatter by hand. This was a delicate operation demanding a steady hand and sharp awareness of the wind. Excess seed would stifle the young growth, yet scarcity would leave bare patches. Birds were a perpetual threat, descending to steal the newly sown grain. Sauer sometimes resorted to shouting, waving flags, or even using children to run through the furrows to drive them away. However, all these efforts would be fruitless if the weather proved uncooperative. Dry springs could wither the seedlings, while heavy rains could either wash them away or cause them to rot in the soil. Hail and strong winds might flatten a field in moments, obliterating months of labor. Life was precarious, entirely subject to nature's caprice. The harvest represented the most crucial and arduous period of the agricultural year. As wheat and barley matured under the summer sun, peasants labored from dawn till dusk to gather the crop before the rains arrived. Equipped with sickles and scythes, they systematically traversed the fields, reaping the grain and binding it into sheaves. The labor was hot, dusty, and irritating. The sharp stalks caused blistered, bleeding hands, while pollen and chaff polluted the air. After cutting, the sheaves needed to be gathered and dragged to the threshing floor for grain separation. Demanding great physical strength, a single sheaf could weigh up to 30 pounds. Men, women, and older children all participated, loading the sheaves onto carts or carrying them on their backs. This was a race against time, as a rainstorm could ruin the cut grain, causing it to sprout or spoil. William Langland captured the hardships and dignity of the medieval ploughman. Born around 1332 in the West Midlands of England, Langland came from a family of small freeholders or weeman. As a young man, he likely worked the land directly, ploughing the rolling hills and fertile valleys of his native Malvern. However, Langland was also a man of letters, having studied at a monastery school and perhaps even Oxford. In the 1360s, he started his masterpiece, Piers Plowman, an allegorical vision combining social satire and spiritual inquiry. The poem's focus is the virtuous ploughman Piers, who represents the ideal of honest labour and Christian modesty. Through his Piers, Langland voiced the common man's suffering during a period of great upheaval. The 14th century featured the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the collapse of the feudal system. Peasants faced increased burdens from heavy taxation and labour scarcity, as the church and nobility became more corrupt and oppressive. Langland directed these frustrations into sharp social criticism. In one vivid scene, he portrays a field filled with idlers, beggars, vagabonds, and friars who avoid honest labor. Piers intervenes, correcting them and urging them to work the harvest and earn their living as true Christians. This was a revolutionary message, championing manual labor and exposing the hypocrisy of the elite. Nevertheless, Piers Plowman is also profoundly spiritual, mirroring Langland's own search for meaning and salvation. Piers embodies a Christ-like figure guiding the dreamer on a pilgrimage to divine truth. The poem explores profound theological questions, sin and redemption, grace and good works, and the path to eternal life. For Langland, the answer resided in the simple dignity of the ploughman's existence. By humbly toiling in the fields for God and community, one could discover a measure of grace amidst earthly suffering. It was a message that connected with ordinary people, and Piers Plowman thus became one of the most widely read works of the Middle Ages. Langland himself remained somewhat enigmatic even to his contemporaries. He appears to have spent much of his life as a poor cleric in London, earning a living by praying for wealthy patrons. He may have experienced hardship. In one haunting passage, he describes himself as clad in coarse cloth by covering a hard bed. Yet he consistently maintained his acute perception of the follies and injustices of his era. Ultimately, Langland's legacy was vocalizing the unheard, capturing the joys and sorrows, hopes and fears of ordinary people. His ploughman Piers transformed into folk heroes, embodying the lasting spirit of the working classes. While much literature was produced by and for the privileged, Langland spoke for the masses, affirming the dignity and value of even the humblest peasant. As we picture Langland tilling the fields, his weathered hands holding the handles, his thoughts weaving visions of sin and salvation, we are moved by his example. He reflects the deep humanity present even in the humblest lives and literature's power to define the struggles of ordinary people. Let us pause as the sun rises over the thatched roofs and the ploughman's weary trudge across the furrows reminds us of William Langland and the countless unnamed peasants whose labours, though obscure, sustained civilization. In their quiet strength and endurance, In their persistent search for meaning through hardship, we may perceive the divine. Caring for animals was as arduous as working the land. Medieval peasants depended significantly on livestock for sustenance, apparel, and labor. They bred cattle for dairy and meat, sheep for wool and parchment, pigs for bacon and lard, chickens for eggs and feathers, and draft horses and oxen for tillage and hauling. Managing these animals was a perpetual duty demanding early starts, lengthy hours, and late finishes. The shepherd was perhaps the most emblematic figure in medieval animal husbandry. Tasked with protecting the manor's sheep, shepherds led solitary, nomadic lives on the fringes of society. They spent their time traversing hillsides and meadows, overseeing their animals as they grazed. This occupation demanded immense patience, alertness, and bravery. Sheep were easily preyed upon by predators like wolves and wild dogs, capable of wiping out a flock in a single night. Therefore, shepherds had to remain constantly vigilant, prepared to ward off attackers using their staffs and slings. They also needed to safeguard the sheep from human threats, thieves and rustlers who would steal lambs or fleeces under the cover of darkness. To guard against these dangers, shepherds often slept outdoors, wrapped in thick woolen cloaks against the cold night air. They sustained themselves with bread, cheese, and ale, supplemented by the occasional lamb or wool from the flock. Her existence was harsh and solitary, with minimal human contact save for rare meetings with other shepherds or road travelers. Nevertheless, shepherding offered its own quiet joys and satisfactions. Shepherds cultivated a profound understanding of their surroundings, knowing the best grazing areas, secure water sources, and the paths and landmarks necessary for guidance. They learned to read the weather in the clouds and winds, to predict storms and showers, taking pride in the health and vitality of their flocks, knowing their skill and dedication produced the wool and mutton that sustained the menorah. Goat herds followed a similar path, guiding their lively, spirited charges to pasture in scrubby hills and rocky outcroppings. Goats were valued for their milk, cheese, and meat, yet they proved notoriously unruly. They consumed nearly anything, including valuable crops and vegetables, and frequently strayed or became trapped in dangerous locations. Goat herds required a keen eye and a steady hand for control. Among pastoral jobs, the swineherd was the lowest. Pigs were viewed as unclean in medieval society, linked to dirt, gluttony, and sin. They frequently roamed freely in forests and woodlands, seeking acorns, roots, and small game. The swineherd was responsible for tracking these wild animals and driving them to market when necessary. This was a dirty, unrewarded job scorned by the other villagers. Swineherds spent their days wading through muddy, tangled brush, shouting and whistling to control the pigs. They were perpetually coated in filth and mud, and the odor of the animals permeated their hair and garments. Even their dwellings on the village fringes were avoided, as if the mere presence of pigs caused contamination by association. Nevertheless, amidst the rough life of swineherders, some discovered a sense of purpose and community. Consider the unique story of Johanna, a young woman who cared for geese for a wealthy landowner in 14th century Germany. Johanna was destined for her lord's estate from birth. As a child, she displayed a talent for handling birds, soothing nervous hens, persuading geese to nest, and gathering eggs with delicate hands. When the lord's goosegirl succumbed to the pox, Johanna was chosen to succeed her. To the surprise of all familiar with her shy, retiring nature, Johanna initially enjoyed her new position. She devoted her days guiding the honking, waddling geese to the finest grasses and clover, observing them consume insects and preen their feathers in the sun. She admired their intricate social structures, the manner in which they formed mated pairs, vigorously defended their nests, and gossiped. She even developed affection for their unique temperaments, the bold gander who invariably led the group, and the meticulous mother who worried about every eggshell. As the months passed, Johanna began to feel the burden of her loneliness. The other villagers stared at the strange girl who spent all her time with birds, muttering and singing to herself while wandering the fields. They whispered that she was possessed, or worse, that she dealt with dark powers to control her flock. These rumors culminated when a series of misfortunes struck the village. The livestock dried up, the crops withered in the fields, and a sickly green mist enveloped the mill pond. Superstitious villagers swiftly blamed Johanna, alleging her strange behavior was a curse. They demanded the Lord act upon his unnatural servant. Johanna's life hung in peril, her existence and means of living threatened by the very animals she cherished. Ultimately, the geese themselves delivered her salvation, so the tale is told. When the Lord's men sought to drag Johanna away, the geese encircled her in a cacophony of honking and flapping, barring all access. The Lord, struck by their loyalty, ruled that no one inspiring such devotion could be a witch, and released Johanna. Afterward, Johanna lived peacefully tending her fowl. She spent her later years on the village outskirts, finding comfort in the simple cycles of the seasons and the companionship of her birds. Though she remained an outsider, whispers of her strange gifts and uncanny bond with nature would echo through the generations, a reminder of the magic found even in the humblest lives. As the sun climbed higher, we left Johanna among her contented flock. Their soft honks and rustles faded into the distance. Her story testifies to the quiet strength and resilience of the medieval peasantry. In carving pockets of meaning and beauty from a cold, unyielding world, they found purpose and connection through tending their animals, a bond that sustained them through hardship. Now, let us turn to the Lord's estate, where a different kind of toil awaits the lowest of surfers. While the fields and pastures offered a degree of wild freedom, the manor house and its outbuildings were a hub of ceaseless labor, dictated by the master and his family's whims and demands. Few jobs were more despised than that of the gong farmer. Before modern sanitation, the disposal of human waste was a critical and unpleasant necessity. Cesspits and latrines required regular emptying to prevent disease and foul odors from overwhelming the home. Gong farmers were tasked with wading into these fetid pits to remove the muck and filth using buckets and shovels. This was a grueling and nauseating job that even seasoned laborers tried to evade. The stench of human waste lingered, clinging to hair and skin long after the work concluded. The gong farmers endured noxious fumes and disease-ridden sludge, which left them susceptible to illness and infection. Shunned by other household staff, they were compelled to eat and sleep apart to prevent contagion. Nevertheless, even in this degrading labor, humanity and camaraderie emerged. Gong farmers frequently worked in pairs or teams, depending on one another for support and security. As they plunged into the murky depths, they formed their own rough humor and rites to manage the vile nature of their job, exchanging crude jokes and remarks while pushing. As the initial golden light of dawn broke through the morning fog, the villagers of Elmwood Village began to awaken. The crow of the cock signaled through the thatched dwellings, announcing the start of another long day of toil. Men, women, and children climbed from their straw pallets, their joints stiff from the damp chill seeping through the walls. They began their day with a meager meal of pottage, a thin gruel of boiled grains and vegetables, before setting out to toil in the fields and pastures. Life was arduous for these peasants, bound to the land and the feudal lords who governed them. From dawn till dusk, they labored over the soil, cared for livestock, and performed countless exhausting tasks. For the privilege of eating out a bare subsistence living, most could expect to live only 30 or 40 years, their bodies worn down by malnutrition, disease, and relentless labor. As the villagers moved to their tasks, let us follow the ploughman to the fields. With a crude iron plough hitched to oxen, he faced the daunting task of tilling acres of rich, heavy soil. The plough was a simple yet crucial tool, little altered since Roman times. More than just a wooden frame with an iron blade for cutting sod and a moldboard for turning it over. This implement nonetheless revolutionized European agriculture in the Middle Ages. The ploughman's labor was arduous and repetitive. He had to maintain a straight and level path, a difficult task when encountering rocks, roots, and clumps of grass. Managing the oxen demanded constant watchfulness and occasional guidance with a goad or whip. At the end of each long furrow, he had to strain on the plough handles to turn the team and start the next pass. Hour after hour, he plodded across the field, leaving behind a neat track of dark, overturned earth. William Langland captured the hardships and quiet dignity of the medieval ploughman. Born near 1330 in the West Midlands of England, Langland spent much of his life as a humble, tattered cleric, yet he could. But he is best remembered as the author of Piers Plowman, a visionary work of literary verse that offers a searing portrait of feudal society. In the poem, Langland introduces a humble ploughman named Piers, who embodies the virtues of hard work, honesty, and Christian charity. Through Piers, Langland voices the struggles and aspirations of the common folk, toiling under the yoke of poverty and oppression. He mourns the church's corruption and the nobility's greed, advocating for a simpler, more righteous existence. Although little is known of Langland's life, echoes of his experiences can be found in the vivid portrayals of rural labour in Piers Ploughman. In a memorable passage he writes, "In a summer season, when soft was the sun, I clothed myself in a cloak as I shepherd were. Habit like a hermit unholy of works went wide in this world wonders to hear." Langland may have been a shepherd or ploughman in his youth, granting him direct knowledge of the peasants' arduous labour. His sympathy for their suffering is evident in Piers, who transforms into a Christ-like figure, guiding the people toward redemption. As the ploughman in Elmwood village completed the final furrow and untied his exhausted oxen, he may have found some solace knowing a poet like Langland had articulated his struggles. With little time to reflect as the sun climbed higher, the sower was already scattering precious seeds on the freshly turned earth, racing against time and weather to ensure a good harvest. The task demanded both skill and stamina. Carrying a heavy sack of seeds slung over one shoulder, he would march up and down the field, casting the grain in a wide arc with each step. Maintaining a consistent rhythm and even distribution was crucial, ensuring each square foot of soil received the optimal seed count. Insufficient seeds led to a meager harvest, while overcrowding caused seedlings to stifle one another. However, the sower's primary adversary was the weather. Sudden rain could wash away the scattered seeds, and drought could dry out the soil, halting germination. And then there were the birds, flocks of crows, pigeons, and starlings that descended upon the freshly sown field, gorging themselves on the tasty morsels. To guard against such threats, the sower might employ various tricks and charms. Some would mix the seed with bitter herbs or crushed pepper to deter the birds, while others would recite rhyming incantations while working, invoking God and the saints for the protection of their precious crop. One popular medieval prayer was, "Holy Mary, Mother mild, bless the seed I sow this day. Let each grain spring forth and grow 100-fold to feed us all." Whether such charms had any real effect is doubtful, but they offered a measure of psychological comfort to the sow as he toiled beneath the hot sun. And when the last seed was cast and the empty sack folded away, he could only trust in Providence and the benevolence of nature to bring forth a bountiful crop. As the sower completed his work and sought a brief, hard-won rest, the reaper was already sharpening his sight in preparation for the harvest. Among all agricultural tasks, reaping the grain was arguably the most physically demanding and time-sensitive. For several crucial weeks in late summer, the entire community mobilized to gather the ripe wheat, barley, and rye before the autumn rains could spoil them. The reaper's tool was the scythe, a long curved blade affixed to a wooden handle. Swinging it in a wide arc, he would cut a swath through the standing grain, allowing it to fall in an orderly row behind him. Closely following, a group of men and women would gather the stalks and bind them into sheaves for transport to the threshing floor. It was arduous labor, demanding a strong arm and a steady hand. The reaper moved at a relentless pace, harvesting as much grain as possible during the long daylight hours, pausing only briefly to sharpen his blade or quench his thirst from a leather flask. He labored from dawn till dusk, his shirt drenched in sweat and his muscles aching with fatigue. Nevertheless, there existed a sense of fellowship and shared goal among the harvesters. The entire village would gather to bring in the crop, with the youngest and oldest pitching in wherever they could. Songs and stories would pass the time and lift spirits. There was always the promise of a harvest feast to look forward to when the last sheaf was gathered. As the harvesters worked the golden fields, spare a thought for the humble shepherd, whose job was lonely and often dangerous. Tasked with protecting the village's valuable sheep and goats, the shepherd labored long days and nights across the hillsides and pastures, exposed to the weather and predators. His primary tool was his crook, a staff with a hook for capturing and managing the sheep. He also carried a sling or horn to ward off wolves or other beasts threatening the flock. But his greatest asset was his loyal dog, a constant companion and invaluable aid in managing the herd. A shepherd's life was solitary, filled with long hours observing the grazing animals. He constantly needed to be alert for trouble, a sick animal, a lost lamb, or a lurking predator. At night, he would gather the flock in a makeshift fold and share watch with his dog, huddled beneath a rough woolen cloak for warmth. Despite the hardships, many shepherds prided themselves on their work and formed deep bonds with their livestock. They could identify each animal by sight and frequently bestowed upon them affectionate names. In a world where most peasants had limited control over their lives, the shepherd enjoyed a measure of autonomy and self-reliance uncommon among his neighbors. Johanna, a young woman living in a Bavarian duchy town in the early 15th century, embodied the role of a shepherd. Having cared for a wealthy landowner's geese since childhood, she earned a reputation as a skilled and dependable goose girl, but her life turned dark when superstitious villagers accused her of witchcraft. They alleged that she employed her unusual skill with animals to conjure spells and curses upon her neighbors. Johanna was arrested and brutally interrogated by local authorities who believed she was allied with the devil. Despite the absence of evidence, Johanna was convicted and sentenced to be burned at the stake. As she was taken to the gallows, she upheld her innocence and dignity, insisting she was merely an innocent girl who had committed no wrong. Legend tells that as flames consumed her, the geese she had cared for so long escaped their pens and flew to her side, honking mournfully as if honoring their beloved mistress. Johanna's tragic story reflects the precarious status of women in medieval society, especially those who lived unconventionally. As a shepherdess and a single woman, Johanna defied the norms of her era and place, ultimately paying the highest price for it. Yet her memory endures as a testament to the resilience and courage of the common people who met hardship with grit and grace. From remote pastures to busy villages, the peasants of the Middle Ages labored without rest to sustain their communities. This was most apparent in the humble yet vital task of managing the pig herd. As stewards of the village's swine, the swineherd embodied both necessity and scorn in medieval society. Pigs were a vital meat source for the peasantry, supplying a dependable protein that could be salted and preserved for the harsh winter. However, they were also unkempt and wild animals demanding continuous oversight. The swineherd was responsible for leading the pigs daily into the forests and fields to gather acorns, roots, and other sustenance. It was a dirty, unrewarding task that frequently required wading through mire and filth while managing the stubborn and occasionally aggressive behavior of the pigs. The swine were controlled using a staff or a whip, and constant vigilance was necessary to detect any signs of illness or injury among them. Furthermore, he had to guard against thieves or wild animals attempting to steal the desirable meat. However, the swineherd's greatest difficulty was the social stigma attached to the occupation. In a culture valuing cleanliness, the swine were perceived as filthy, low-class beings, scarcely superior to the animals they managed. Consequently, he was frequently ostracized by his neighbors and excluded from the social and religious rites that connected the community. Despite these difficulties, the pig herd was crucial to the village economy, providing a consistent supply of pork for everyone. Like many of his fellow peasants, he also managed to find small moments of joy and significance amidst ceaseless labor. As the swineherd returned to the village at day's end, he might pause to admire the sunset over the fields or enjoy the simple comforts of a hot meal and warm fire. These small pleasures made life bearable for medieval commoners facing hardship. In fact, the loneliness and marginalization of the humblest peasants may have fostered a unique resilience and fortitude within them. Consider the story of Tyler, a man who ascended from obscurity as a roofer to become one of the most famous rebels in English history. Born in the mid-4th century in Kent, Tyler spent his early life toiling on church estates to earn a meager living. Roofing was a skilled trade, yet it demanded long hours of perilous work at the tops of high buildings in all weather. Though Tyler might have been illiterate, he possessed intelligence and charisma, coupled with a sharp awareness of the injustices suffered by the peasantry. In 1381, these grievances ignited into open rebellion as thousands of peasants revolted against the oppressive poll taxes levied by King Richard II and his unpopular ministers. Tyler became one of the revolt's leaders, commanding a large body of rebels who marched on London, burning and looting along the way. The rebels' demands were simple yet far-reaching: an end to suffocation, the right to rent land at reasonable rates, and the removal of corrupt officials from power. For a brief time it seemed they might succeed, as the king was compelled to meet Tyler and the other leaders at Mile End. However, that moment was fleeting. During a fierce confrontation at Smithfield, Tyler was suddenly attacked and stabbed by the Mayor of London, William Walworth. As he died, the king's men moved in to crush the rebellion, dispersing the peasant army and pursuing its leaders. Tyler's death concluded the peasant revolt, yet his legacy persisted as a symbol of resistance against tyranny and oppression. For centuries thereafter, his name was called upon by numerous other rebels and reformers, from the Lollards to the Chartists. For medieval peasants, Tyler's story demonstrated that even the lowest among them could challenge the established order and strive for an improved existence. This message would endure through generations as common people persistently fought against the constraints of feudalism and oppression. However, not all peasants were inclined toward rebellion. For many, the daily necessities of work and survival offered little space for aspirations beyond the present. Few jobs were more arduous than that of the gong farmer, the unfortunate soul tasked with clearing village cesspits and latrines. In a world lacking modern sanitation, human waste was a constant and foul presence in medieval villages. The gong farmer's duty was to remove and safely dispose of this waste, a task demanding both a strong stomach and a sturdy constitution. Equipped with a long-handled scoop and a bucket, the gong farmer would enter the dark, foul-smelling depths of the cesspit, wading through the muck to extract the accumulated waste. This labor exposed him to numerous diseases and infections, from dysentery to typhoid fever. Nevertheless, the gong farmer's work was vital for the village's health and well-being. Without proper waste disposal, streets and alleys would quickly accumulate filth and vermin, creating breeding grounds for disease and pestilence. Despite their vital contributions, gong farmers were among the most despised and marginalized in medieval society. They were often forced to live on the village outskirts, shunned by their neighbors, and excluded from many communal social and religious activities. Yet, even in this humble and unpleasant work, moments of humanity and compassion emerged. A story recounts that of a gong farmer named John, tasked with clearing a cesspit at a local monastery. While working, he found a small, malnourished child who had fallen into the pit and was nearly dead. Without hesitation, John descended into the filth to rescue the child, cleansing him and wrapping him in his own cloak. He brought the boy to the monastery infirmary, where the monks nursed him back to health. Upon hearing of John's selfless act, the abbot was moved to reward him with a small plot of land and new clothes, a rare acknowledgement for a man who labored in obscurity, reminding everyone that even the humble possess kindness and compassion. As the gong farmer dragged his buckets through the village streets, he might have found some solace in knowing his difficult labor was vital to his community's welfare. And perhaps, like John, he hoped his efforts would someday be acknowledged and compensated, even slightly. Hope was a valuable possession for medieval peasants, a small light amidst darkness and hard work. And that hope was most desperately needed among the poor souls tasked with excavating the ville's ditches and trenches. Ditch digging was among the most physically taxing and poorly paid occupations in medieval society, demanding long hours of arduous labor in all weather, with little more than a spade and a wheelbarrow. The ditch digger's job was to unearth the deep, narrow trenches that functioned as the village's main drainage and defense. These channels were vital for directing rainwater and sewage. As the sun sets, throwing long shadows across the fields and thatched roofs, the exhausted peasants return home after another day of hard labor. Their sore muscles and rough hands reflect the constant work that consumes their waking hours. For most, escaping the crushing poverty and servitude that defines their lives offers little hope. Yet, even amid hardship, occasional reprieves bring a glimmer of joy and respite to the downtrodden. Church feast days, though infrequent, provide an opportunity to set aside labor and celebrate the saints with humble feasts and merrymaking. The harvest celebrations, when the last sheaves of grain are finally bundled and stored, are a time of music, dancing, and a few precious hours of revelry before the cycle of planting and reaping begins anew. Then there are the traveling minstrels, those wandering troubadours who occasionally pass through the villages, bringing with them tales of far-off lands, epic romances, and heroic deeds. For a few enchanted evenings, the peasants can lose themselves in the magic of storytelling, forgetting the grinding reality of their lives. The minstrels' melodies and ballads stir a longing in their hearts for adventure, love, and a world beyond their village and the dictates of their feudal lords. This very yearning for something more has at times driven the peasants to rise up against their oppressors. The desire for freedom from the subjugation of serfdom and ownership of their own land fueled rebellions and uprisings throughout the Middle Ages. The peasant revolt of 1381, led by the charismatic rebel Wat Tyler, saw thousands of commoners march on London, demanding an end to the crippling taxes and abuses imposed by the ruling class. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed, and Tyler himself brutally executed, it sent shockwaves through English society and sowed the seeds of resistance that would continue to grow in the hearts of the people. But for most peasants, open rebellion was a luxury they could ill afford. Their lives were an unending cycle of work, punctuated only by the briefest moments of rest and the constant spectre of hunger, disease, and the whims of their masters. They labored from dawn till dusk, their destinies interwoven with the land and the changing seasons. Still, their struggle possesses a quiet dignity, a resilience forged by necessity, and the unbreakable ties of kinship and community. As twilight descends and the peasants find rest in their simple dwellings, we are reminded of the innumerable generations preceding us, whose efforts, blood, sweat, and tears laid the groundwork for our present world. They endured unimaginable hardship, yet possessed great strength, endurance, and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be broken, even against the most daunting odds. Therefore, let us remember the medieval peasants not merely as faceless figures from the distant past, but as individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and stories. From William Langland's inspiring story, The Ploughman Who Became a Poet, comes the peculiar legend of Johanna the Goose Girl, accused of witchcraft by superstitious villagers. Each peasant possessed a unique tale, even if history has largely omitted them. As we sleep, let us remember those long-ago laborers whose lives differed greatly from ours, yet whose struggles and victories still echo across the centuries. In remembering them, we acknowledge the resilience of the human spirit and the lasting power of hope against hardship. Though the Middle Ages may seem far away, the peasant's story mirrors our own, a narrative of suffering and sorrow, yet also of bravery, kindness, and the unbreakable ties of our shared humanity. Therefore, let us travel back once more to a world illuminated by fire and the sweat of honest work. As the peasants close their weary eyes and drift into a deserved sleep, we too may allow ourselves to enter sleep, assured that their legacy persists in the very fabric of our modern world. As we dream, perhaps we will glimpse those ancient fields and villages and the resilient people who called them home, a reminder of our progress and the obligation we owe to those who preceded us. Even in sleep, history's wheels turn slowly yet relentlessly. Changes sown in the Middle Ages will eventually yield fruit as the feudal order crumbles, allowing new ideas and opportunities to flourish. The Renaissance and the Age of Exploration loom, poised to transform the world in ways even the most visionary peasant could never have conceived. Thus, we depart the medieval village, leaving behind its thatched roofs, muddy lanes, hardships, and small joys. The peasants will rise with the sun to start another day of labor, their lives dictated by the land's eternal rhythms and the relentless demands of their feudal lords. Yet amidst their struggles, they hold the spark of something greater, the resilience, the ingenuity, and the unbreakable spirit that will eventually shape human history. As we mark the end of the Middle Ages and its trials, let us embrace the lessons of the peasants, the value of labor, community, and the enduring strength of the human heart. Let us never forget the countless generations of forgotten heroes who labored in obscurity, whose blood, sweat, and tears forged the world we inhabit. The story of medieval peasants ultimately testifies to the indomitable human spirit, reminding us that hope and resilience can thrive even in the darkest times. As we drift into sleep, hold fast to that hope and the knowledge that though the road ahead is long and challenging, we possess the same strength and determination our ancestors maintained through the ages. Let us sleep and dream of a world transformed, where the heavy toil of the peasants has yielded to new opportunities and horizons. Let us awaken with renewed purpose, ready to embrace the torch passed to us, to build a future honoring their sacrifice and enduring spirit. Ultimately, the story of the peasants is the story of us all, a reflection on our progress and the limitless potential awaiting those with the courage and vision to pursue it. As the sun sets, stretching shadows across the fields, weary peasants return home. Their backs ache from laboring over crops, their hands rough and calloused from holding tools. The air carries the smell of earth and the sharp odor of farm animals. Despite daily hardships, there is satisfaction in a job well done, knowing their labor provided sustenance from the land. Yet for many, this contentment fades quickly. As they walk familiar paths to their modest homes, the harshness of their lives presses down. Tied to this land and their Lord's will, they have little hope of escaping poverty and servitude. Their days are an unending cycle of labor. Their nights are a brief respite before a new beginning. Yet even in this bleak existence, moments of joy and celebration exist. Church feast days offer a welcome break from drudgery, allowing them to gather with family and friends to share the harvest's bounty. The arrival of a traveling minstrel brings excitement, sharing news from distant lands and tales of adventure to brighten the long evenings. And then there are the whispers of rebellion, the dream of freedom stirring in some hearts. They have heard tales of peasant uprisings elsewhere, of brave individuals who defied their oppressors. Some even hope to shed the yoke of servitude and secure a better life for themselves and their children. One such dreamer was Tyler, a humble roof tiler from Kent. Born into poverty, Watt quickly mastered his trade and earned a reputation for his industrial skill. Known for his sharp wit and disdain for authority, these traits proved advantageous later on. While moving from village to village and practicing his trade, Watt witnessed the suffering of the peasants firsthand. He heard their grievances regarding high taxes and corrupt officials, the way they were treated as livestock by their lords, and began to dream of an alternative reality where common people controlled their own fate. When the peasant revolt broke out in 1381, Watt swiftly joined it. He galvanized his fellow tradesmen and laborers, encouraging them to fight their oppressors. As the rebellion gained momentum, a charismatic leader emerged who inspired hope among the downtrodden. For a brief time it appeared the peasants might achieve their freedom. They marched on London, tens of thousands strong, and presented their demands to King Richard II. However, the king's promises of reform were empty, and the rebellion was ultimately suppressed by the nobility. Wat Tyler paid the ultimate price for his role in the uprising. He was brutally executed, his head placed on a pike to warn those who might challenge the status quo. Yet his legacy endured, a symbol of the common man's unyielding spirit. As the peasants prepare for the night, gathered around the meager warmth of their fires, they hold fast to this spirit. They recognize their hardships and the unfavorable odds they face. Yet they also recognize they are not isolated. Others share their aspirations for a better world. Thus they endure the long years of the Middle Ages, weathering famine, plague, and war. They, toiling in fields and villages across noble estates and the lonely edges of society, they form the very backbone of this world, the unsung heroes whose labor and sacrifice will forge the path to future change. Looking back from today's perspective, it is easy to view the peasants as mere footnotes in history, a downtrodden mass with brief, harsh lives. However, to do so would be to overlook the true significance of their story. In their struggles, triumphs, dreams, and determination, the peasants of the Middle Ages established the foundations of the world we inhabit. Their labor erected the magnificent cathedrals and castles that remain proofs of human ingenuity and skill. Their revolts and uprisings sowed the seeds of democratic ideas and eroded the rigid hierarchies of the feudal system. Furthermore, in their quiet reflections within the tales they narrated and the melodies they performed, they bequeathed a profound cultural heritage that echoes throughout the ages. From Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to the haunting songs of anonymous folk singers, the voice of the common person resonates through history, highlighting the enduring power of the human spirit. As we sleep, let us remember the peasants of the Middle Ages, the men and women who carried the weight of their world. Let us recall their names, actions, joys, and sorrows. Let us honor their memory by striving to build a world where their dreams can one day become reality. The story of the peasants is the story of all of us. The common thread connecting humanity throughout the ages, a narrative of hope, heartbreak, struggle, perseverance, and the indomitable will to survive and flourish amid hardship. And it is a story that will continue as long as there are those who labor and those who dream, those who toil and those who dare to imagine a better world. As the last embers of the hearthfire fade and the peasants sleep, the outside world grows still and silent. The fields, forests, villages, and towns are all shrouded in darkness, awaiting a new dawn. And in that darkness, the spirit of the peasants endures, a reflection of the human heart's lasting strength, the insatiable desire for freedom and justice that resides within us all. Let us now rest and dream of a world where the peasants' aspirations may eventually be fulfilled. Let us find peace in knowing their struggle was meaningful, their legacy persisting in the world we now inhabit, built on their foundations. Let us rise to greet the morning with fresh hope and renewed purpose. Ready to undertake the task they began so many centuries ago, building a world where all may live in dignity and peace. As the weary shepherds guided their flock back to the safety of the village, their bleating charges ambled along well-trodden paths. The sinking sun painted the sky in hues of orange and crimson. The day's work was finished, yet tomorrow promised repetition. Caring for the animals, guarding them from predators and thieves, and bearing the difficulties of an outdoor life. For shepherds and goat herders, the elements offered little respite. They slept under the stars, bundled in coarse woolen cloaks, perpetually watchful for peril. Wolves stalked the forest edges, their howls slicing the night, and sly foxes crept in to steal lambs from their mothers. Human threats, bandits and rustlers also stole entire herds, forcing shepherds to endure their lord's anger. Nevertheless, a sense of peace existed within this pastoral life. The sheep's soft chewing while grazing, the jingle of bells on their necks, and the tender bleats of newborn lambs, these sounds defined the shepherd's days. They occupied the long hours by etching fine patterns into wooden staffs or playing simple melodies on reed pipes. Some even penned verse, drawing inspiration from the wild landscape. One such shepherd was a young man named Peter. He had raised sheep since childhood, mastering the craft from his father and grandfather. Peter possessed an innate talent for animals. He could soothe a nervous ewe with a soft word or guide a stray lamb back to the flock with a few whistles. He valued his labor, understanding that the wool from his flock would yield warm garments and the meat would sustain the hungry villagers. Yet Peter dreamt of an alternative existence, unconstrained by the elements or his lord's decrees. He had heard stories of magnificent cities where individuals were free to chart their own course, to master a craft or enter a guild. He envisioned himself as a master weaver, crafting exquisite tapestries for noble families, or a skilled mason, imprinting his mark on enduring cathedrals. For now, Peter's world was confined to the rolling hills and lush pastures of his lord's estate. He knew the land intimately, from the streams where his flock drank to the shady groves where they found refuge from the midday sun. He had even named some of his favored sheep, including Old Baylor, the matriarch, and little Milo, the runt who had survived a particularly harsh winter. As twilight deepened and the stars ignited overhead, Peter rested for yet another night outdoors. He wrapped his cloak and leaned back against a twisted oak. His loyal sheepdog lay curled at his feet. Distantly, he could discern the village sounds, dog barks, children's laughter, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It served as a reminder that even in the solitude of the pastures, he remained part of a community dependent on the labor of shepherds like him. As Peter drifted to sleep, his thoughts turned to the tales of great shepherds from the past. Saint Patrick, patron of Ireland, once tended sheep as a slave before becoming a bishop and spreading Christianity, and King David of Israel, who began as a humble shepherd boy before defeating Goliath and becoming a renowned ruler. Peter knew such great achievements were unlikely, yet he found solace in knowing that even the greatest figures had once watched over a flock, just as he did now. With that, he closed his eyes and allowed the soft bleating of his sheep to soothe him to sleep, prepared for another day as a medieval shepherd. However, not all peasants who worked with livestock enjoyed the tranquility of a shepherd's existence. Those tending pigs, for instance, faced days filled with the strong odor of swine and the ceaseless grunts and squeals of their animals. Swine herds occupied one of the lowest positions in the medieval world, often scorned by other villagers. This disdain stemmed from the belief that pigs were unclean animals, linked to filth and disease. They were frequently allowed to roam the village's muddy streets, digging through refuse and waste for sustenance. Swine herds were responsible for managing the pigs, leading them into the forests daily to gather acorns and other fodder. This was an unrewarding duty, demanding resilience and patience, as pigs were notoriously willful and prone to mischief. Therefore, the swineherd constantly maintained vigilance, employing sticks or whips to control the pigs and prevent them from damaging crops or entering gardens. Despite the challenges, some found joy in working with pigs. One such herd belonged to a woman named Johanna, who had tended them on her lord's estate for as long as anyone could recall. Johanna was a peculiar figure, with a wild man of greying hair and a face weathered by years spent outdoors. She was notorious for her peculiar habit of conversing with the pigs as if they were old companions, bestowing upon them names and even singing to them while leading them to the pasture. Some villagers whispered that Johanna was a witch, suggesting her unusual bond with the swine was evidence of dark magic. They cited the fact that her charges invariably appeared to be the fattest and healthiest in the area, boasting lustrous coats and full bellies that commanded a good price at market. Surely, they whispered, this indicated some form of witchcraft. But Johanna ignored the gossip. She understood her success with the pigs stemmed from diligent labor and a profound grasp of their requirements. From a young age, she had learned to detect signs of sickness or suffering in the animals, and she knew exactly what to feed them to maintain their health and vigor. Nevertheless, despite her commitment, Johanna's life was very difficult. The swine herds were among the poorest peasants, often struggling to make ends meet with their meager wages. Johanna's hut was a dilapidated structure with a leaky roof and drafty walls that offered little warmth. She ate a diet of bread and porridge, occasionally supplementing with meat scraps from slaughtered pigs as a rare indulgence. Yet Johanna found comfort in the simple joy of watching her pigs root and play in the woods. She understood her efforts were crucial for the village's survival. Without the meat and lard from the pigs, many would starve through the long winter. Thus she persisted daily, year after year, caring for her animals with near religious devotion. As time passed, the rumors concerning Johanna's alleged witchcraft became more persistent. Some claimed to have witnessed her dancing nude under the moonlight, amidst her pigs. Whispers circulated that she possessed the ability to transform into a pig, prowling the forest nightly to hunt unaware prey. The manor's lord, being superstitious, grew increasingly uneasy with Johanna's presence on his estate. Eventually, a group of villagers confronted her while she was leading her pigs back to the manor, accusing her of using black magic to ruin their harvests and steal their children, demanding she be tried as a witch. Johanna, weary and lined from a long day in the fields, merely smiled and shook her head. "You fools," she said, her voice rough with age and wisdom. "I am no witch, just a simple swineherd who knows her trade. My magic is nothing more than hard work and a love for these creatures." The villagers, startled by Johanna's calm, began to whisper among themselves. Some even felt shame regarding their accusations, acknowledging the truth in the old woman's words. Finally, they allowed her to go, watching as she vanished into the woods with her pigs following. Johanna continued to care for them for many years thereafter, until she finally passed away peacefully in her sleep. The village mourned her loss, only then recognizing the worth of her tireless labor. They interred her by the forest edge, where her cherished pigs could graze near her grave. The legend of Johanna the swineherd became part of village lore, underscoring the quiet dignity and persistence of even the poorest peasants. Her story was shared by hearthfires and over ale, a testament to the enduring spirit of those who labored in the fields and forests, sustaining the world and the machinery of society. As the sun rose over the village again, bathing the thatched roofs and muddy streets in a warm light, the peasants left their huts to start another day of work. Shepherds led their flocks to the pasture. Swineherds drove their pigs into the forests, and ploughmen harnessed their oxen to heavy wooden ploughs to turn and prepare the earth for planting. Among those heading to the fields that morning was a young man named William. William, like his father and grandfather, was a ploughman and took immense pride in his labor. He understood that a successful harvest relied on the skill and strength of men such as himself, capable of guiding the plough straight through the rich, dark earth. However, William was unsatisfied with his circumstances. He was a dreamer with a sharp mind and a deep curiosity about the world outside the village. As a child, he learned to read and write from the local priest, evading his chores to examine the few treasured books in the church library. He had absorbed tales of great heroes, distant realms, and monarchs clad in armor. Now, as he worked behind his plough, feeling the sun and sweat, William's thoughts drifted back to those stories again. He envisioned himself as a knight riding to battle on a noble horse, his armor gleaming in the sun, or perhaps a scholar like the wise men he had read about, who devoted their days to studying the universe's mysteries in grand libraries and universities. But William knew these dreams were foolish for a man of his rank. He was a ploughman, tethered to the land and the will of his lord. His days were consumed by toil and his nights by exhaustion, offering little prospect of escape or advancement. Yet something within him resisted this fate. He felt a stirring in his soul, a yearning for something beyond the confines of his village and his duties. As he guided the plough through the field, William's mind turned to the tales of a great poet, a man named Piers a Ploughman. Piers, a ploughman, had somehow found the words to capture the joys and sorrows of peasant life in verse. His poems described the beauty of the changing seasons, the reward of hard labor, and the injustices of a world that scorned the poor. William had never personally read Piers's poems, but he had heard excerpts recited by traveling minstrels and learned men passing through the village. He was astonished by the prospect that a humble ploughman could forge something so beautiful and deep, something capable of moving the souls of people from every background. As the sun scorched his back and the ground gave way beneath him, William made his choice. He would learn to write like Piers Ploughman, to immortalize the essence of his life and the lives of those near him in words that would last forever after his death. He would find a way to recount the peasants' stories, to give voice to their struggles and triumphs. He knew it would not be easy. He would have to steal time from his work to practice his letters in the dirt with a stick or scratch them onto parchment by candlelight. He would have to endure the scorn and derision of those who viewed writing as a frivolous pursuit, unworthy of a man of his standing. But William was determined. He had tasted the power of words, and he would not allow that power to escape. As days bled into weeks and weeks into months, William persisted in working the land, his body becoming lean and strong through the ceaseless cycle of ploughing, sowing, reaping, and threshing. Yet in the pauses he would draw out his treasured scraps of parchment and his rough quill to write. Initially, his words were awkward and hesitant, his hand shaky, and his spelling uneven. As he practiced, his skill expanded. He absorbed the rhythms of speech, the cadences of the seasons, and the joys and sorrows of peasant life. He chronicled the arduous labor of the fields, the simple delights of a warm meal and fire, and the dread of famine and sickness that plagued every peasant's dreams. In writing these accounts, William began to sense purpose, a faint hope in a world that had always appeared so grim and inflexible. Though he knew his words would remain unseen by anyone outside his village, destined to fade with him, he still wrote, pouring his heart and soul onto the page to give voice to the voiceless and the forgotten. Years passed. William grew old and grey, his hands gnarled by the plough and his eyes dimmed from writing by candlelight. Yet he continued to write, filling every scrap of parchment with his verses and stories. As he lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his family, he smiled with peace and fulfillment. "I have lived a peasant's life," he whispered, his voice frail and ready. "But I have also lived a poet's life, and in the end, that is all that matters." With those words, William closed his eyes for the final time, his life's work finished. Though his name would never be remembered in history, his words would endure, a testament to the spirit of the peasants who labored in the fields and yearned for a better world. As news of William's death reached the village, the peasants assembled to mourn the loss of one of their own. They might not have grasped the worth of his writing, perhaps unaware he had been scribbling during his breaks, but they knew he was a good man, a diligent worker, and a kind soul. They interred him in the churchyard, his grave bearing a plain wooden cross. As they stood over the freshly turned soil, the priest offered words of comfort, reminding them that even the simplest lives could possess meaning and purpose in God's sight. Yet among the mourners, one perceived more in William's life than the simple piety of a peasant. This was the young priest's assistant, Thomas, who had been assigned to inventory William's scant belongings after his passing. There, among the tattered tools and patched garments, he discovered a small leather-bound book filled with William's writings. As Thomas read the book, his eyes widened with every verse, filling him with excitement and wonder. It was a trove of peasant wisdom and insight, a view into a world frequently ignored and disregarded by the learned and the powerful. It was proof that even the lowest among them could possess valuable things to say, something that could shift how people perceived and felt about their surroundings. Thomas was determined not to let William's work be forgotten. He resolved to take the book to the monastery where he had been trained, to present it to the scholars and scribes who dedicated their lives to preserving ancient wisdom. He would share the story of William the Ploughman, the peasant poet who embodied the spirit of his life and era in plain, sincere verses. With the book securely in his satchel, Thomas began his long trek to the monastery, his heart brimming with hope and purpose. He anticipated the journey would be arduous, fraught with challenges and obstacles. Yet he also recognized that he carried something invaluable, a force capable of transforming lives and inspiring future generations. As he walked, Thomas reflected on William, remembering the quiet strength and dignity he displayed against a harsh and unyielding world. He also thought of all the other peasants like him, the men and women who labored in the fields and forests, the shepherds and swineherds, the ploughmen and threshers. Though unseen by the powerful, they formed the very backbone of the world, driving society forward with their sweat and blood. With every step, Thomas cultivated a growing sense of pride and purpose. Though he was merely a priest's assistant, the scene unfolded as the sun descended behind the hills, stretching long shadows across the fields. Weary peasants made their way back to the village, their aching muscles and weathered hands reflecting the arduous day of labor. The air was thick with the rich aroma of wood smoke drifting from the humble thatched cottages, a sign that the women were busy preparing the evening meal. In a small hut, a man named John Potok stirs a bubbling pot of pottage over the crackling fire. John is the village potter, a skilled craftsman who shapes rough clay into sturdy vessels for storing and cooking food. It is a respectable trade passed down from father to son, yet the work is grueling. The heat from the kiln has left his face permanently reddened and his hands rough and calloused. As John ladles the steaming pottage into crude bowls, his wife Agnes sets out a loaf of dense, dark bread. It is a meager meal, yet a welcome one after a day spent bent over the potter's wheel. Their children, 2 small boys and a girl, eagerly gather around the rough table, grateful for the simple fare. Across the village, a hunched figure shuffles toward his hovel, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. This is old Thomas, the oldest inhabitant of the village. His once robust physique is now stooped and contorted by age and a lifetime of arduous labor. In his youth, Thomas was a falconer, training hawks and falcons for the Lord's hunts. It was a prestigious yet solitary occupation. Frequently spending long hours in the fields and forests, far from human company, the falconer often found himself alone. As Thomas lies down on his straw pallet, these memories surface: the falcon's sharp cry, the sweep of wings, the exhilaration of the hunt. Though difficult years, they were also good ones. He reflects on the young man he was, brimming with hope and aspirations for a better life. Dreams that never materialized, eroded by the constant cycle of labor and destitution. Elsewhere in the village, a woman kneels by a stream, scrubbing clothes on a washboard. This is Martha, the village midwife and healer. Her role carries immense responsibility, aiding in births and caring for the sick and wounded, yet it is also an unstable one. If a birth is difficult or a patient dies, the midwife is frequently blamed, sometimes even accused of witchcraft. Martha's hands are red and cracked from ceaseless washing, and her back aches from bending, yet she understands her role is essential. Without her skills, many more mothers and babies would perish. As she hangs wet clothes to dry, Martha whispers a quiet prayer for her village's well-being. As night descends, the peasants assemble in small clusters, gathered near wavering rush-like candles. They exchange narratives and melodies, finding solace in the company of those nearby. Ancient stories are recounted once more, legends of valiant knights and lovely maidens, of playful sprites and sagacious old crons. For a brief span, the trials of their existence vanish, absorbed by the enchantment of the teller's words. But the candles soon fade, and the villagers retire to bed, aware that morning arrives prematurely. They sleep deeply, worn out by the day's toil, their dreams filled with the endless cycle of labor that defines peasant existence. Still, even within this difficult life, moments of joy and beauty persist. The joy of children playing in the dappled fields, the sweet taste of a ripe berry warmed by the summer sun, the quiet fulfillment of a job well done, a difficult task achieved through skill and perseverance. These are the small treasures that make life worthwhile, granting the peasants the strength to face another day. Despite the hardships, they are a resilient people, their spirits unyielding. Hope is found in the shifting seasons and the firm conviction that brighter times await. Thus, these simple people persevere, cultivating the land and caring for the animals. Their lives are deeply intertwined with the medieval world. As darkness falls and the village sleeps, we reflect upon the innumerable generations of peasants whose labor and struggle established the world we inhabit. Their existence was arduous, marked by ceaseless labor and meager compensation. Yet it was also a life imbued with profound dignity and subtle heroism. Though their names may fade and their tales be erased by history's passage, their legacy remains, imprinted in the earth they cultivated, the stones they placed, and the skills they mastered. They formed the foundation of medieval society, the unheralded champions who sustained the mechanisms of civilization through the bleakest eras. Let us remember these humble peasants as we sleep in our comfortable beds. Let us honor their strength and sacrifice, and cherish the freedoms and comforts we enjoy now. By doing this, we keep their memory alive, a light against the age's darkness. As the first rooster crows, signaling a new day, the village awakens, a new cycle begins. The cycle of planting and reaping, birthing and dying, the endless turning of the seasons, through all this, the peasants persevere. Their lives stand as proof of the human soul's unyielding spirit. As the swineherd herds his pigs back to the pen, the sun sinks lower, bathing the Lord's estate in a warm golden light. John, the gong farmer, is just commencing his unwelcome task for the day. He gathers his implements, a long-handled ladle, a bucket, and a simple cloth mask for his face. With a heavy sigh, he proceeds to the estate's first cesspit. The stench strikes him like a physical assault as he lifts the cover. John attempts to breathe through his mouth as he plunges his ladle into the dark, viscous depths. He scoops the sludge into his bucket, choking on the overwhelming odor of human waste and rot. It is a repulsive task, yet someone must perform it. Even lords and ladies must obey nature. John feels lucky to have steady work, however unpleasant. He thinks of his friend Thomas, a ditch digger who spends his days kneeling in mud, digging trenches and drainage channels. It is back-breaking labor, worsened by the biting flies that swarm the workers under the hot sun. As John moves from cesspit to cesspit, he dreams of a better life. Perhaps like a skilled craftsman such as the blacksmith or the thatcher. But these trades are often inherited from father to son. John's father was a gong farmer, as was the one before him. It seems his fate is sealed, much like the noxious contents of his bucket. Nearby, the steady thunk of an axe rings out as the woodcutter fells a tree. It is dangerous work, with the constant risk of being crushed by a falling trunk or losing a limb to an errant swing. The woodcutter's arms ache with fatigue, yet he cannot rest. The estate's fireplaces and ovens possess a constant hunger for fuel, and it is his duty to satisfy it. His mind wanders to the wild stories of the charcoal burners who dwell deep in the woods. They are a peculiar, solitary group, spending months tending their smoldering piles of wood. Some claim they hold secret knowledge of ancient customs, pagan rites, and forest spirits. Others suggest they are outcasts, pushed to the margins of society by wrongdoing or insanity. As the woodcutter pauses to wipe his brow, he sees a procession heading toward the village churchyard. Leading it is the stocky figure of Tom Dunn, the gravedigger, a grim, taciturn man perfectly suited to his morbid trade. Tom has plenty of work due to frequent disease outbreaks, harsh winters, and occasional violence between feuding lords. Some village women whisper that he is cursed, his closeness to death having tainted his soul. They claim he speaks to the dead he buries, that he extracts gold teeth and rings from their stiffening jaws. Rumors also suggest he is seen walking the churchyard at night, his lantern creating eerie shadows among the gravestones. But Tom pays no attention to such talk. He is too absorbed in the endless cycle of digging and filling, of laying the dead to rest in the cold, dark earth. He harbors a grim pride in his work, knowing he is the last to handle the earthly remains of the departed. As the gravedigger's procession recedes, John the gong farmer finally completes his nauseating rounds. He sets down his bucket and walks toward the small hut he calls home. His wife Agnes is stirring a pot of thin gruel over the fire. She wrinkles her nose as John enters. The stench of the cesspits clings to his clothes and skin. John splashes some precious water from a basin onto his face and hands, attempting to rinse away the worst of the filth. He knows he should be grateful for his lot in life. After all, he has a roof over his head and food in his belly, however meager. Yet sometimes he dreams of a reality where a man's value isn't defined by the toil etched on his skin or the hardened texture of his hands. He contemplates tales of magnificent cities where thinkers engage in discourse within vast chambers and traders amass wealth from commerce. He ponders the possibility of freely charting his own course, of being more than a mere component in the feudal structure. But such musings are perilous for an unprivileged peasant. John understands his station, toiling on the Lord's estate from birth to death. This is the established and enduring reality. As he eats his sparse meal, he anticipates the coming tasks, emptying cesspits, ploughing fields and tending livestock. It is an endless cycle of exertion and hardship, yet it remains the sole existence he recognizes. And yet, amidst this bleak existence, moments of joy and connection persist. The laughter of children in the village square, Agnes' smile, the simple pleasure of a full belly and a fire on a cold night. These are what sustain John, giving him the strength to face another day of toil and hardship. Those small comforts, they are enough in a world that is often nasty, brutish, and short. As the last light vanishes and the stars emerge, John closes his eyes, surrendering to weariness. Tomorrow promises only repetition, more grime, sweat, aching muscles, and blistered hands. Yet for this moment he can rest and dream of a life outside his humble existence. The village falls into its nightly cadence. The soft murmur of families by the fires, the occasional bleat of a goat or whinny of a horse. The distant hoot of an owl in the woods. The peasants slumber, their bodies and minds exhausted by the day's labors, yet even in sleep they are not entirely free. Their dreams are haunted by the specters of hunger, sickness, and the capricious whims of their feudal lords. They twitch and mutter, their faces tightly gripped by fear, pain, or despair. And yet, within the darkness, hope flickers. The dream of a better life, a world where fate is not set by birth. It is a fragile flame, constantly challenged by reality's harsh winds, yet it persists. The peasants, deep in their weariness, sense that change is approaching. They sense it in the restlessness of their hearts, in the whispered talks of rebellion and revolt that drift through the village like smoke. One day their voices will rise in a mighty chorus, demanding justice and freedom. One day the chains of the old order will be broken and a new world will emerge. But for now, they sleep. They rest their battered bodies, bracing for the struggles ahead, and keep hope alive in their dreams, knowing darkness must yield to dawn. As the first rooster crows and the peasants awaken from slumber, the cycle begins anew. They rise with aching backs and calloused hands, ready for another day of toil. Some care for the animals, others go to the fields, their stoic faces concealing inner weariness. John the goat farmer picks up his feared bucket, anticipating the stench. Thomas the ditch digger takes his shovel, already calculating the hours until rest. Agnes stokes the fire, preparing the day's meager meals, her mind fixed on her children's empty stomachs. In the distance, the Lord's manor is visible. A symbol of wealth and power, they are far removed from the peasants' daily struggle for survival. They recognize their position in this feudal hierarchy, perpetually subject to the desires and commands of their supposed overlords. Yet seeds of change have been sown, beginning to sprout in unforeseen locations. A veteran of the 100 Years' War returns to his village with tales of a broader world. A traveling monk preaches radical equality under God. A restless young peasant dared to dream of a life beyond his station. These ideas spread rapidly, passing from peasant to peasant through fertile whispers and knowing glances. They spoke of a world inverted, of lords and ladies humbled and common folk elevated. They spoke of ancient rights and freedoms long suppressed but not forgotten. Thus, even while engaged in their grueling labor, the peasants nurtured this spark of rebellion within their hearts. They understand the path ahead will be arduous and dangerous. They know many will suffer and perish in the coming struggle. Yet they also recognize they can no longer tolerate the burden of servitude, grinding poverty, and constant humiliation. They have experienced the prospect of a superior life, and they are prepared to fight for it, regardless of the cost. Thus they continue to labor, their bodies strained, but their spirits remain resolute. They bear the present's trials, fueled by the dream of a better tomorrow. They await the moment when the scales will balance, when the fury of the oppressed will erupt and sweep away the old order like chaff. This is the unvoiced tale of the medieval peasantry, not merely a record of their toil and suffering, but a testament to their resilience, tenacity, and insatiable thirst for justice. This narrative resonates through the ages, highlighting the unyielding spirit found in every fight for liberty and self-respect. As we look into the past, remember the common people, the gong farmers and ditch diggers, the woodcutters and swineherds. Honor their sacrifices, victories, dreams, and resistance. Ultimately, it was their toil and blood that built the world we inhabit now. Their unrecognized bravery established the foundations of the rights and freedoms we currently possess. Though their names may be forgotten by history, their legacy remains. As long as those dedicated to a better world persist, their story will never be erased. The sun climbs higher, illuminating the medieval village. The peasants continue their toil, their existence a demonstration of the unyielding human spirit confronting hardship. This narrative has existed since civilization's dawn and will endure as long as hope for a better future exists. For now, we let them work, certain that their struggles and victories will resonate through history. Sleep well, weary listener, and may the quiet bravery of these medieval peasants offer solace and inspiration even during the bleakest periods. As the sun dipped below the horizon of the medieval village, bathing the thatched roofs and muddy lanes in a warm, golden light, exhausted peasants trudged home after another demanding day of toil. Their hands were rough and their faces etched by countless hours spent working the fields, raising animals and serving their feudal masters. Despite their suffering, a quiet dignity remained in their simple existence, a resilience and strength born from hardship. For the majority of peasants, escaping the oppressive poverty and servitude that defined them offered little hope. They were tied to the land, their destinies inseparable from the wealth of their noble lords. From birth to death, they were fated to till the fields, cultivate crops and livestock, and obey their masters without question. Yet, even within the routine of feudal life, there were occasional instances of respite and happiness. The church feast days were highly anticipated events, pausing work as the village gathered to celebrate their faith and community. Harvest time also brought satisfaction and camaraderie as neighbors collaboratively gathered the ripe grain before winter arrived. Additionally, traveling minstrels sometimes passed through, sharing songs, stories, and news from faraway places. For a few precious hours, the peasants could escape their worries and immerse themselves in stories of valiant knights, beautiful maidens, and magical beings. This was a rare view of a world beyond their limited scope. Nevertheless, these momentary delights did not alleviate the constant hardship and struggle of peasant life. They were subject to the forces of nature, susceptible to droughts, floods, and plagues that could ruin their harvests and cause starvation. Living in constant fear of disease, they lacked any knowledge of how to prevent or treat the illnesses that plagued their communities. The specter of war and marauding armies, capable of destroying their fields and homes, constantly loomed, leaving them destitute and starving. Thus, it was understandable that the dream of freedom and a better life smoldered in the hearts of many peasants. Though they risked severe punishment or even death for defying their masters, some dared to revolt against the oppressive feudal system. In England, the peasant revolt of 1381 saw tens of thousands of commoners rise against the nobility, demanding an end to usury and unfair taxation. Though the uprising was ultimately suppressed, it caused shockwaves through medieval society and planted the seeds of change that would gradually develop over the following centuries. As night descended and the peasants settled into their humble dwellings to rest their weary bodies before another day of labor commenced, one could only imagine the dreams that crossed their minds, dreams of a life free from servitude, a world where they controlled their own fates. Though they were the lowest members of medieval society, a fierce and unquenchable spirit burned within them, one that would endure through the ages and lead to the freedoms we now possess. Let us pause and reflect on the lives of these medieval peasants, the common folk whose labor and quiet strength formed the foundations of the modern world. Though forgotten by history, their legacy endures in the values of perseverance, resilience, and hope they exemplified. As we sleep, let us carry their stories and honor their sacrifices. By remembering and learning from the past, we may discover the wisdom and courage needed to face our present challenges. The peat diggers were another group of medieval peasants who labored in obscurity, performing arduous work essential to their communities. Before coal or gas, peat was a vital fuel for heating and cooking. However, extracting this dense, spongy material from boggy wetlands was difficult. Peat diggers ventured into the misty moors, armed with sharp spade-like tools called sloe. With practiced motions, they would carve rectangular blocks of peat from the waterlogged soil, each roughly the size of a brick. This was grueling, repetitive labor that caused their hands to blister and their muscles to ache. The heavy waterlogged peat needed to be hauled from the bog and carefully stacked to dry, a process potentially taking weeks or months. Nevertheless, some peat diggers found solace and even beauty in their solitary endeavors despite the difficulties of their work. Among these figures was Meg, a wife of Pete who resided in Scotland during the 14th century. Little is known about Mag's life, yet fragments of her poetry remain, providing a rare view into the mind and spirit of a medieval peasant woman. In her verses, Mag described the tranquil grandeur of the moors, the shifting hues of the seasons, and the plain happiness of a life lived in accord with nature. She drew her inspiration from the wild landscape surrounding her. From the purple heather blooming in summer to the ghostly wisps of fog drifting over the bogs in the early morning, Me's poetry also hinted at the hardships and sorrows of her existence. She wrote of the aching loneliness of long days spent in the peat fields, far from the companionship of her fellow villagers. She grieved the loss of loved ones taken prematurely by illness or mishap, and wrestled with the bitter unfairness of a world prioritizing the rich and powerful over the humble and diligent. Despite her struggles, Meg's words expose a woman of profound sensitivity and fortitude, one who discovered beauty and purpose even amidst the most arduous conditions. Her poetry embodies the resilient human spirit and affirms that hope and creativity persist even in the bleakest periods. Reflecting on Meg, the peasant wife, and the many other peasants who lived in obscurity during the Middle Ages, we recognize the quiet strength and dignity of the common folk. Despite being overlooked or dismissed by their social superiors, they played an essential role in shaping history, establishing the foundations of the world we inhabit. Therefore, let us remember and honor the peat diggers, the lime burners, the shepherds and the ploughmen, all the humble laborers who worked in the fields and villages of medieval Europe. Though their stories may be largely forgotten, their legacy endures in the values of hard work, perseverance, and hope they exemplified. As we sleep, let us carry their memory and be inspired by their example to face life's challenges with courage and grace. The lives of medieval peasants were not only defined by their labor, of course. Despite grinding poverty and social constraints, these men and women still found ways to carve out moments of joy, community, and self-expression in their daily lives. One of the most anticipated breaks from the daily grind were the church feast days that punctuated the medieval calendar. On these holy days, work was forbidden, and the entire village would gather to celebrate their faith and enjoy a much-needed respite from their labors. The air would resonate with the sounds of ringing church bells, cheerful music, and laughter as families and neighbors assembled to feast, dance, and socialize. For many peasants, these festive occasions offered a rare chance to enjoy some revelry and excess. Tables would be laden with hearty dishes, such as roasted meats, savory pies, and fresh bread, all accompanied by plentiful ale or mead. Children played boisterous games, while elders gossiped, traded stories, and sometimes engaged in good-natured rivalry with neighbors. However, church feast days offered more than just food and fun. They also fulfilled a vital social and spiritual role, strengthening community ties and shared faith that aided peasants in enduring life's difficulties. In a world where most people seldom ventured beyond their village, these gatherings offered a chance to connect with the wider world and feel part of something larger. Likewise, the harvest season held immense importance for medieval peasants, signifying the end of months of toil and worry. As the crops matured in the fields, the entire community would organize to gather the valuable yield before the weather shifted. Men, women, and children labored together from dawn till dusk, using sickles to cut grain, bundle it into sheaves, and carry it to the threshing floor. Though this was exhausting and all-consuming work, it also fostered a sense of purpose and fellowship. The harvest's success determined whether winter would bring comfort or hunger and hardship, so everyone participated to ensure no grain was lost. When the final sheaf arrived, the village erupted in celebration with feasts, dancing, and songs of thanks. For a few shining moments, class and status dissolved, uniting everyone from the poorest to the local lord in shared joy and relief. It served as a reminder that despite medieval hardships and injustices, there was still much to be grateful for. Not all the pleasures of peasant life were shared. Individuals found ways to express creativity and enjoy solitary pleasure amidst their daily work. Many were skilled artisans, crafting beautiful items such as pottery, textiles, and ironwork in their free time. Others sought comfort in music, poetry, or storytelling, using these arts to articulate their hopes, fears, and dreams. And then there were the small, everyday moments of beauty and wonder that punctuated even the bleakest days. The sight of a rainbow across a stormy sky, the sound of a nightingale's song in the twilight, the feel of a cool breeze on a hot summer afternoon. These were the simple, ephemeral pleasures that reminded peasants of the natural world's magic and mystery, even amidst their struggles. Reflecting on the lives of medieval peasants often leads to focusing on their hardships and injustices. However, it is crucial to remember that these individuals were more than just the result of their labor and suffering. They possessed personal hopes, dreams, and moments of joy, regardless of how brief or intense. By seeking to understand and value the entirety of their experiences, we can develop greater empathy and connection with those who preceded us. We can draw inspiration from their resilience, creativity, and capacity to find beauty and meaning even in the most challenging situations. In this way, we might learn to navigate our own lives with more perspective, gratitude, and grace. As we sleep, let us reserve space in our hearts for the peasants of the Middle Ages and for all those throughout history whose stories have been lost or ignored. Let us commemorate their struggles, triumphs, sorrows, and joys. We must carry forward their legacy of perseverance, community, and hope as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of our era. By remembering and learning from the past, we may discover the wisdom and courage needed to forge a brighter, more compassionate future for everyone. As the sun ascended over the thatched roofs and smoke drifted from the chimneys, the village awoke. Roosters announced the dawn as weary peasants left their simple dwellings to confront another day of relentless labor. Life for a medieval peasant was a harsh reality of grinding poverty and exhausting work from sunrise to sunset. Most were born into servitude, tied to the land they tilled and subject to the desires of their feudal lords. They managed a meager subsistence, toiling in the fields and forests, raising livestock, and performing the menial tasks that sustained the system. The feudal system that dominated medieval Europe was a rigid hierarchy with the king and nobility at the top and the lowly peasantry at the bottom. While some freemen and yeoman farmers experienced some independence, the vast majority were serfs who owed labor and a portion of their harvest to their lord in return for a small plot of land. They were not slaves in the strictest sense, as they could not be bought or sold like livestock, but they lacked true freedom. A typical peasant family lived in a small 1- or 2-room hut, its walls made of woven branches and its roof covered with straw. If they had been lucky, they might have possessed a dirt floor littered with rushes and a smoky hearth for warmth and cooking. However, many had even less. Their belongings were plain and few, perhaps a straw pallet for sleeping, 1 or 2 wooden chests, a wobbly table and stools, a few clay pots, wooden bowls and spoons, and a precious knife or 2 constituted their meager wealth. Privacy was absent in these enclosed spaces shared with animals. Diet was equally meager and repetitive, featuring mainly coarse bread, pottage, a thin vegetable soup, and occasional salt pork or fish for those with slightly more means. The poorest survived on little more than grain and whatever vegetables they could cultivate. Hunger was a persistent shadow, particularly during lean winters or famine. A peasant's day commenced before dawn, rousing them from restless sleep to care for the animals, milking the cows, feeding the chickens, and slaughtering the pigs. Shepherds led their flocks to pasture, anxiously watching for wolves. Goat herds climbed rugged hills and cliffsides with swift leaps in search of food. As morning broke, most villagers went to the fields extending beyond the village. There, countless hours were devoted to monotonous work, planting and reaping the wheat, rye, barley, oats, peas, and beans that fed the people. Life was a harsh existence dictated by the elements, pests, and the harvest's outcome. Huddled in the morning cold, the ploughman directed his slow oxen as they wrestled with the heavy wooden plough. Step by step, furrow by furrow, he worked the earth the ancient way, unaltered for ages. It was taxing labor that left him bone-weary and sore by evening. Following him were the seers, carefully scattering the precious seed saved from the last harvest. With a swift flick of their wrists, they threw the grain onto the fertile earth, aware that their family's survival hinged on their skill and judgment. Would birds steal the seed? Would heavy rains drown the young shoots? Only time would reveal. When the wheat turned a toy gold under the summer sun, the reapers gathered, armed with curved sickles, bent double as they methodically threshed the stalks into sheaves for collection and threshing. It was a race against time and weather to finish the harvest before autumn storms could spoil the crop. Men, women, and children all had essential roles, and none were idle. When not engaged in field work, peasant women looked after the young, old, and sick, maintained the fire, fetched water, baked bread, brewed weak ale, and if possible spun wool and coarse cloth for clothing. Even 5-year-old children contributed to the household by gathering eggs, picking vegetables, herding geese, or deterring birds from the crops. While most peasants lived unrecorded, their lives unnoticed, a few remarkable individuals overcame adversity to leave their mark on history. William Langland is one such figure, born around 1330 in the English Midlands to a poor yet devout farming family. Although details of his early life are few, Langland, as an intelligent boy of humble origins, faced limited prospects. Like many others, he appeared set for a life of menial labor. However, fate and the local clergy intervened. Impressed by his quick mind and devotion, the parish priest took an interest in the youth, teaching him to read and write. In an era when literacy was a rarity among the lower classes, this gift of education would change the course of Langland's life. With his new skills, Langland was able to join the ranks of the minor clergy, likely starting as a lowly parish clerk before working his way up to become a chantry priest. It was a respectable post affording status and security, if not great riches. Yet, despite his education, Langland never forgot his origins. He remained deeply disturbed by the suffering of the common people and the daily injustices he observed: poverty, disease, corruption within the church, and the arbitrary cruelty of the nobility. These burdens weighed heavily on his soul, compelling Langland to channel his compassion and anger into his life's mission. A vast allegorical poem, Piers Plowman, rich with satire and social critique, details the dreamlike journeys of a humble ploughman named Piers seeking truth and insight. In his name, Langland articulated the voices of the oppressed peasantry, revealing their suffering and humanity. With sharp wit, he exposed the hypocrisy of the clergy and the greed of the aristocracy, advocating for Christian charity and the honor of honest work. Though written in the Middle English vernacular instead of Latin, for the educated, Piers Plowman achieved widespread agreement and sparked calls for reform. Langland's compassion and understanding raised the struggles of ordinary people to the level of literature and influenced subsequent writers for ages. In a life that might have been ordinary, William Langland chose to be a witness and advocate for his fellow peasants. His words granted them an immortality they never foresaw as they walked home each evening, exhausted, with the earth still beneath their nails, rising to toil anew. For those who loved animals more than crops, herding sheep or goats provided a measure of freedom and movement, if not ease. Entrusted with the Lord's valuable livestock, they spent their days roaming the hillsides and pastures, vigilantly guarding their woolly charges from predators and thieves. It was a lonely, rugged existence, exposed to the elements. Shepherds thought nothing of bedding down with their faithful dogs beneath the stars, wrapped only in a rough woolen cloak for warmth. They were a resourceful breed, skilled at using a sling against wolves and playing cheerful tunes on a pipe during the long, slow hours of grazing. Yet even this pastoral ideal could be broken by fate, as the strange and sad story of Johanna the goose girl reveals. Johanna was a simple maid, content in her humble life, caring for the geese of the wealthy Franklin family on the village outskirts. With her flock of noisy, beady-eyed birds, she would roam the common lands and fields, a girl overshadowed by her squawking, flapping displays. The villagers would smile watching her pass, followed by a great white and grey cloud of honking geese, unaware of anything but the next treat. Johanna managed these animals skillfully, using soft words and the occasional sharp wave of her crook. She took pride in presenting them plump and pristine for the Franklins' table during high feast days and holidays. Yet beneath her sunny exterior, Johanna held a secret passion. Whenever she could steal a moment from her geese, she would rush to the hedges and forest edges to gather herbs. Fever FW, tansy, pennyroyal, wolf Spain. Through patient experimentation, she mastered the arts of healing and remedy, applying her potions and poultices to sick villages and birthing mothers. Word of her gift spread, and soon people from all over the district sought the goose girl for her cures and midwifery skills. To the desperate and ailing, Johanna was an angel of mercy. But to others, especially those in power, an unlearned peasant girl meddling in such matters could only be a witch. Accused by envious rivals and fearful clerics, Johanna was arrested and hauled before the court. In vain, she protested her innocence, claiming she was merely a simple goose girl who only sought to aid the needy. However, the forces arrayed against her were relentless. Witnesses emerged to testify they had seen her consorting with imps and devils under the moonlight, collecting strange herbs for her vile wounds. Under threat of torture, poor Johanna confessed to all sorts of bizarre crimes and dalliances with Satan. Her terrible fate was sealed. As she was burned, the sentence was delivered swiftly and mercilessly. The pious villagers who had once begged for her help now jeered and cursed as she was led to the pyre, lamenting her betrayal and wicked actions. As the flames licked around her, Johanna's desperate screams cut through the air, blending with the fire's crackle and the honking of the geese set free to roam. A sharp scent of herbal smoke mixed with the inferno, casting a bitter irony upon her end. So perished Johanna, the goose girl, a casualty of her era's ignorance and superstition. Her transgression was not malice, but rather compassion disguised by the peasant knowledge of herbs and healing. In an age where women, particularly those of lower status, were easily demonized, her fate was all too frequent. Not every position on the manor permitted the small liberties and open spaces enjoyed by goose girls and shepherds. For those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, only the most menial and disagreeable tasks were assigned. Chief among these was the reviled role of the gong farmer, a lowly servant tasked with the unenviable duty of cleaning latrines, privies, and cesspits. Day after day, these wretched souls would wade knee-deep in the fetid muck, shoveling the waste into buckets to haul away and dispose of. The stench was unbearable, a noxious miasma of human excrement mingled with rotten food scraps, animal dung, and other vile effluvia. Even the toughest person would gag and heave, eyes streaming as they struggled to breathe through a rag tied across their face. But more terrifying than the stench was the real threat of illness. The gong farmers waded exposed through a toxic mixture full of parasites and germs, at a time when concepts of cleanliness and sanitation were completely unknown. It is no surprise that so many succumbed to dysentery, cholera, and other terrible sicknesses. Their lives were tragically brief. It indicates that this critical yet detestable job was allocated to the lowest rung of the feudal order. These were the disposable, the outcast, their lives deemed of little value apart from the repulsive function they performed. They were ostracized by their peers and exist mostly as anonymous, forgotten footnotes in the historical records. Higher on the scale of estate drudgery were the ditch diggers, assigned the back-breaking labor of draining land for agriculture, digging irrigation channels, and excavating defensive trenches for the Lord's fortifications. From dawn till dusk, they hacked at the stubborn earth, throwing shovels of dirt until their hands blistered and their shoulders ached. It was a Sisyphean effort, as soon as one section was cleared, silted up, or collapsed, they had to begin anew. The ditches were their territory, standing water and sucking mud their constant companions. Mosquitoes, leeches, and venomous water snakes were an ever-present hazard, not to mention the risk of cave-ins and drowning. Many were the mothers' laments for sons who marched off to dig and never returned, their lungs choked with muck, or their bodies broken beneath a ton of crumbling earth. To sustain life was a brutal struggle, an unending fight against nature, powered only by meager food and the overseer's whip. Then there were the woodcutters, resilient souls who traveled to the Lord's forests to fell and haul the massive timbers that fed the manor and village's insatiable fires. Their world was made of sap and sawdust, of flashing axes and ringing wedges, and straining sinews and crushing burdens. Felling a mature oak or elm was no easy task in an era without motorized saws and metal wedges. Equipped only with hand-forged axes and primitive tools, woodcutters would hack and chop for hours to bring down a single tree, clearing the debris with shouts as the giant finally fell. However, this was only the start. The real challenge was delming, bucking, and splitting the massive wood into manageable pieces for transport. Green wood is dense and resistant, actively fighting the blade throughout the cutting process. A person could expend immense energy wrestling a single log onto a cart, only to have to repeat the effort many times over. Accidents were frequent and gruesome, resulting in crushed limbs, severed fingers, and fatal blows from kickback and widowmakers. A falling tree represents an immense and merciless force, and the woodcutter who misjudges its lean or neglects escape planning will face the ultimate cost. Numerous village women became widows because of a stray bow or a slight movement of an axe. Nevertheless, despite its dangers, the profession of a woodcutter possessed a certain allure, and standing among the peasants, it offered a rugged independence, a feeling of skill and command far from the monotonous chores of the fields and livestock pens. To some, the woodcutter represented the wild, untamed essence of the forest. So it was for Tyler, a simple man who earned his daily bread hewing wood and laying thatch for the manor roofs. Born a servant with no prospects beyond a lifetime of servitude, he nevertheless dreamed of a better lot, of a world where a man might be master of his own fate. As he toiled amidst the timber and straw, what would compose stirring speeches in his head, railing against the injustices of the feudal order. He advocated for every individual's right to freedom, to possess land and the profits from their labor, an end to the arbitrary abuses and heavy taxes imposed by the gentry, and for the common people to unite to break their chains and reclaim their inherent dignity. Initially, his message was ignored, as his fellow peasants were too intimidated and oppressed to believe change was achievable. The yoke of serfdom had been their bitter inheritance for generations. Who were they to question their masters or the natural order of things? But what would not be deterred, with the zeal of a prophet, he continued to preach his gospel of liberation, gathering a small but passionate band of followers. They met in secret in forest glades and thatch huts, plotting and planning for the day they would make their stand. That day arrived in the summer of 1381, when simmering discontent over a hated poll tax finally erupted into open rebellion. Across England, peasants revolted, burning manor houses and assaulting tax collectors. This was the moment Watt had anticipated. Emerging from the Kent forests, a multitude of soldiers and labourers marched on London, their numbers growing with every mile, and these ragged rebels instilled fear in the establishment. Their demands to abolish serfdom and feudal privileges directly challenged the established power of the crown and church. In a brief, heady moment, it appeared Wat and his followers would prevail. They stormed the Tower of London, executed the despised Chancellor and Treasurer, and even gained an audience with the boy King Richard II, who yielded to their power. However, fate and treachery conspired against them. During a heated discussion at Smithfield, Wat was unexpectedly attacked and stabbed by the Lord Mayor of London. As he lay bleeding, the rebellion dissolved into chaos, and the king's men advanced for execution. Tyler, the visionary woodcutter and peasant hero, would not witness his dream of a more just social order realized. Captured and condemned as a traitor, he was hanged. As the sun slowly sets over the thatched roofs of the village, the peasants make their weary way home after another long day of toil. The soot-streaked blacksmith banks the forge fires, stretching his aching muscles. The thatcher descends carefully from the roof he was mending, straw clinging to his clothes and hair. In the churchyard shadows, the gravedigger's hunched figure plunges his shovel into the earth one last time before going home. These are the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages, the common folk whose backbreaking labor kept the world turning. Though they lacked the wealth and privilege of nobles in their grand castles and manors, they possessed something perhaps more valuable: grit, resilience, and an unbreakable spirit that refused to be crushed by hardship. Consider the story of Meg, Pete's wife. Her life was one of solitude and relentless toil. She spent long hours in the chilly, murky waters of the peat bog, day after day, cutting and carefully stacking the heavy blocks of peat to dry. Her only companions were the birds and the wind whistling through the reeds. It was a lonely, backbreaking existence, yet Mag found beauty in it. In the quiet moments between her labors, she would scribble poems on birchbark scraps, ode to the vibrancy of dragonflies dancing over the water, and the sweet scent of wildflowers speckling the boggy fields. Her poetry described the simple joys and sorrows of peasant life and her profound bond with the land that supported her. Though Meg's story may be forgotten by history, her spirit endures in countless other peasants who discovered small moments of grace and beauty within their toil. The shepherds marveled as the first tentative lambs of spring took their uncertain steps. The reaper who paused to wipe the sweat from his brow and marvel at the glint of the sun on the scythe's blade. The thatcher who took pride in a roof well mended, knowing it would keep a family safe and warm. And then there were the peasants who dared to dream of something more, the ones who refused to accept that a life of servitude was all there could be. Folk heroes such as Tyler rose from humble origins, leading the peasant revolt of 1381 in a fierce, defiant stand against the oppression and injustice of the ruling class. Tyler's story, like many peasant tales, began with a life of grinding poverty and backbreaking labor. As a boy, he learned roof tiling from his father, spending long hours hauling heavy bundles of clay tiles up ladders and across unstable rooftops. It was a perilous and arduous trade. Yet Tyler felt a deep pride in his abilities and his strength. However, as he aged, Tyler grew to resent the restrictive boundaries of the feudal system that imprisoned peasants like himself in a loop of poverty and servitude. He observed how the nobility exploited their riches and authority over the common people, overwhelming them with taxes and compelled labor. And he observed how the clergy, intended to be society's moral compass, frequently favored the rich and powerful instead of the oppressed masses. This ignited a spark of righteous anger in Tyler, which would soon become a blaze of rebellion. In 1381, upon the crown's imposition of another crushing tax on the peasantry, Tyler reached his limit. He galvanized his fellow villagers, calling upon them to rise and fight for their rights as free Englishmen. The news of the uprising spread rapidly across the countryside. Soon, tens of thousands of peasants joined the movement, marching on London to demand an end to arbitrary rule and unfair taxation. Led by Tyler, the rebels stormed the Tower of London, capturing and executing the hated men who had long oppressed them, the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Treasurer. For a brief shining moment, it seemed the peasants might actually triumph, as if the world they knew could be remade into something new and better. But this did not happen. The young King Richard II, fearing the rebels' growing power, lured Tyler into a trap and brutally executed him. His head was then displayed on a pike as a warning to all who dared defy the crown. The peasant revolt was suppressed, and the aspiration for a more just and equitable society faded into history. However, the spirit of defiance embodied by Tyler would not be entirely extinguished. It persisted among the peasants who continued to labor and struggle, who discovered small joys and meaning in their difficult lives, and who maintained the hope that future generations might experience a better world. As night descends upon the medieval village, the final peasants secure their doors against the cold. Within the smoky gloom of their dwellings, they huddle by the hearth's meager warmth, sharing tales of the day's toil and the aspirations that sustain them. A mother soothes an anxious child with a song about Johanna the goose girl's valor. A weathered swineherd recounts his youthful exploits to a gathered audience of young men. A peak cutter's wife softly and liltingly recites one of Meg's poems in the firelight. These are the stories that will sustain them through the coming years. Tales of ordinary people who faced immense hardship with courage, resilience, and grace. Though history books and royal chronicles may omit them, these stories will endure in the hearts and minds of their descendants. The peasants who continue to till the fields, raise the animals, and build the world anew with the sweat of their brows and the strength of their backs. As we sleep, our minds filled with the sights and sounds of that ancient world, we find comfort in knowing their legacy endures. In every farmer who draws life from the stubborn soil, in every laborer who takes pride in a job well done, and in every soul who stands for what is right and just, the spirit of the medieval peasant endures, unbroken and unconquered. It stands as a testament to the unyielding courage of the common person. Let us remember them, these humble historical heroes, the ploughmen and shepherds, the grave diggers and gong farmers, the peat wives and the goose girls. Let us honor their struggles, triumphs, sorrows, and joys. Let us carry their stories as we confront our present challenges, drawing strength and inspiration from the knowledge that we are all the inheritors of their unyielding spirit. As the final embers of the hearth softly glow in the darkness, we close our eyes and allow the gentle rhythms of the medieval world to soothe us to sleep. The distant lowing of cattle, the soft wind rustling the thatch, the creaking timbers, and the sigh of sleeping peasants. These elements merge into a calming melody, reflecting the profound bond we hold with those who preceded us. As we enter slumber, we can almost perceive them, the peasants of ages past, toiling and striving, filled with love and laughter, their faces etched with the joys and sorrows of a life fully lived. These forgotten heroes remain with us, watching from the mists of time, always reminding us of the human spirit's enduring power to overcome, endure, and dream. And so we sleep, held by the warmth of their memory, secure in the certainty that no matter the trials ahead, we will meet them as they did, with courage, compassion, and an unwavering faith in the inherent goodness of every person, regardless of their station or circumstance. This is the legacy of the medieval peasant, a legacy of hope, resilience, and the wild beauty of the human soul. May it guide and sustain us now and forever as we navigate history's winding paths, authoring our own narratives of struggle and triumph, sorrow and joy within the great and eternal chronicle of human life. As witnessed, Pete Digger's life was marked by solitude and hardship, isolated from the daily rhythms and social interactions of village life. As villagers congregated in the square to socialize or seek solace in their faith at church, the Peak Digger retreated deeper into the bog's wilderness, discovering a peculiar calm only disturbed by the spade's squelch and the wind's rustle through the reeds. Yet, even on the edges, in the fringes of the medieval world, there existed faint glimmers of light, beauty, and humanity amidst the suffering. Meg, the peat wife, as she came to be known, was a beacon. Toiling alone season after season in the marshy peat bogs, Mag developed a singular connection to the natural world around her. In the brief pauses between the ceaseless work of cutting and stacking the heavy peat bricks, she composed poems, simple, heartfelt verses that captured the subtle shifts in light through the mists, the sounds of the manbirds, and the small joys of a rare flower blooming in the barren bog. Meg's poetry remained largely unheard during her life, passed down only in whispered fragments to the few people she met on the peat marsh. But they bore these modest yet deep expressions of a world-weary spirit still holding on to wonder. Like the lead she extracted from the earth, compressed and preserved through the ages, In Meg's poetic fragments, we glimpse the inner lives of the forgotten people at the base of the feudal structure. Their dreams, sorrows, and small acts of defiance against a destiny as rigid and unbending as the medieval social order. For the peasantry collectively, the daunting structure of that social order largely persisted as the Middle Ages drew to a close. The Peasant Revolt of 1381, the most extensive popular uprising medieval England had witnessed, caused widespread agitation after erupting in London streets. However, it was quickly and severely suppressed, its leaders executed, and its aspirations for change nullified. Even in defeat, the Peasant Revolt signaled the tectonic shifts beginning beneath the surface of the medieval world. The rigid feudal system, defined by its hierarchy and unquestioned legitimacy, was collapsing under its internal contradictions. The growth of cities and commerce was fostering a new middle class poised to challenge the supremacy of the landed aristocracy. The Black Death, which had previously decimated Europe's population, paradoxically strengthened the labor force by making it a scarcer resource. As the medieval peasantry experienced another arduous day, the faint promise of a new era began to emerge, though change would arrive gradually with numerous obstacles and setbacks. The seeds were planted and destined to grow through the fissures of the feudal structure until they erupted, reshaping the world. The medieval peasantry, from the field worker to the gong farmer, from the unacknowledged digger to the simple shepherd, may have endured a life of arduous, unrewarded labor. Yet through this toil they established the very foundations of our modern world. In their struggles, endurance, fleeting joys, and raw sorrows, we see the human spirit in its resilient, vulnerable glory. As we sleep, let us remember Meg, the peat wife and her kin, for the poor Middle Ages peasants and all they bequeathed to human history. They are the unseen threads woven behind the glittering warp of kings and conquerors. Yet without them, no tapestry exists. Sweet dreams, dear listener. If you enjoyed this dull yet enlightening journey through medieval history, please give a drowsy thumbs up and subscribe for more sleep-inducing yet strangely stimulating content. Good night.